of the things that has surprised me the most about the competitive scene in the TCG of Yu-Gi-Oh right now is the almost general fall of Cosmos. In the past, I took the position that one of the big reasons Cosmos underperformed in, I guess, the 2015-2016 competitive season was that Cosmo Tin Can was a Trojan horse of sorts for this deck, where players would chase after the +1 Tin Can produced, causing them to modify the deck away from its strengths, making it inherently weaker against other meta decks like Burning Abyss and Monarchs, despite Cosmos having an inherent advantage over both of these decks. For the entire argument regarding Tin Can, look at the link in the description. I don't really want to rehash it here. Also, I have said previously that the Kozmo archetype is a power deck with large OTK potential first and foremost. Is it the best OTK deck in the game? I would argue no. But unlike other prominent OTK decks like Mermails or Fluffles, for example, Cosmos has very strong field control elements. In fact, I have argued that Cosmos is the only deck in the game that can be viewed as a top 5 OTK deck and a top 5 control deck, but its true strength is as a power OTK deck with control elements. Its strengths do not lie as a control deck with OTK elements. However, that issue appears to be one of the major problems that continues to plague Cosmo deck design. Another problem is that too many people focus on adding unnatural elements to Cosmos, perhaps in a sense of chasing this control strategy. All of the major Cosmo hybrids fall into this category: Cosmo Artifact, Cosmo Fire King, True King, or Metal Foes. All of these hybrids have the same general destroy your own cards to trigger ship strategy: Cosmo Demise and Cosmo Kaiju. Cosmo Artifact attempts to use the Artifact engine to prevent the opponent from accessing their extra deck and provides intermediate interruption via Morale Tech. The Destruction Hybrid component deck attempts to augment the OTK capacity of the deck. Demise attempts to use large levels of back row to produce interruption and counter opponent plays, and the counter ability associated to Kaijus is rather obvious. However, as I mentioned, none of these elements really work well with Cosmo. The main problem with Cosmo has always been consistency, not breaking or preventing opponent boards. The need to run a large number of high-level monsters falls into the same design strategy as Monarchs, yet the inherent special summoning ability through the low-level monsters, the pilots, gives the deck a significant consistency advantage over decks like Monarch, especially now. However, it does not provide a consistency advantage over most other decks. Fortunately, Cosmos make up for this lower than average natural consistency by having much higher than average power and field control. With this understanding in mind, designing a hybrid around the idea of preventing the opponent from making a board that would later need to be broken at the price of sacrificing consistency seems improper. Yet that is exactly what is happening in all of these hybrid decks. For example, when hybridizing with artifacts, you're adding a bunch of level 5 monsters that have non-traditional summoning conditions. Really, who cares that they can be triggered during an opponent's turn by Sliprider? The drop in consistency far outweighs any advantages produced from artifacts. For, let's be realistic, triggering an artifact summoned during the opponent's Sliprider is not a smart use of its ability a majority of the time. And if you're running cards like Twin Twister or Mystic Space Typhoon, you want to use those on your opponent's back row that might shut down your flow and consistency rather than, again, triggering your own artifact. The only thing that saves the artifact engine is Artifact Sanctum, but Sanctum does not provide nearly enough benefit for the loss of consistency you see by running a bunch of level 5 monsters that you traditionally can't use. Fire King and True King is a crazy balancing act between having enough ships so that Island or Diagram is not incredibly inefficient, but not so many ships that your hand bricks constantly without the field spell. Not surprisingly, this balancing act commonly fails, and bricking happens far too often. Kaijus are inherently inconsistent in combination with Cosmos, and they certainly do not need more high-level monsters with non-traditional summoning conditions, i.e. artifacts. The OTK potential is meaningless, for it almost entirely relies on opening with Slumber to have any chance to occur. You only have 2 copies of Slumber and no real reliable way of searching it. That doesn't seem like a strategy one should be pursuing. Finally, reiterating what I said in the past about Demise Kozmo, Demise eliminates the ability to special summon on the turn it's activated, whereas Cosmos are a very special summon heavy deck, especially when going for their OTKs and high damage plays in general. Special summoning is how Cosmos produce most of their on-field advantage and hurt the opponent. Thus, running cards that restrict special summoning does not make much sense. Some may argue that, due to the quick play pilot effect, losing the ability to special summon during the Cosmo player's turn is not significant because it can be done during the opponent's turn if danger exists. I tribute off a pilot to summon X ship. But what happens if the special summoning is needed on that turn? I.e., what happens if it's not the first turn? You're basically dead in the water, you lose tempo, you lose pace, and whatever cards you drew, they better be good, or the opponent is going to take advantage of that loss of tempo. Regarding generic revival like Call of the Haunted or Aces of Dragonsoul, the natural synergy of Cosmos focuses on going from the hand to the field to the banished zone, generally skipping permanents in the graveyard if it can help it. It'll stop by in the graveyard for a moment, but then right on to the banished zone. Whereas generic revival only focuses on the graveyard. Basically, most of the time in a Cosmo deck, when you draw a generic piece of revival, it will be dead. Or it should be, unless things are going grievously wrong for you. So, in the context of a Demise Cosmo deck, the switch to a more controlled, grindy deck away from the OTK field control power produces more inefficiency. Some could say that the newest hybrid with Zodiacs sidesteps these issues, but I'm not so sure. There is no good link between Zodiacs and the general strengths of the Rapier engine and Cosmos. One argument would be that Barrage combos very nicely with the ship, allowing it to float and the player to break out the standard Zodiac combo. But with Rapier semi-limited and the loss of Norden, the impact of that combo has become much less meaningful. Now opening Rapier is not that strong for this deck, as it sacrifices flow and speed. While Zodiacs are not surprisingly the best hybrid option for Cosmos, I don't think they make the deck better than a pure version of Cosmos. Overall, hybrids fail in Cosmos because they take away deck spaces that can be better allocated to more and effective resources to push the natural Cosmos strategy. To that point, here's my current Cosmo deck. For the ships, I run the one allowable Dark Destroyer, 3 copies of Forerunner for its non-targeting characteristic and life gain, which is important in this deck because it does eat a lot of life points, death by 1,000 cut, so to speak, and 3 copies of Sliprider for extra deck versatility and back row destruction. I side both Dogfighter and Landwalker. Dogfighter is a nice solid card for the current meta, able to freely put on token threats both from a tribute standpoint or an offense-defense standpoint. But without knowing what the opponent's deck is, it can be ineffective. I don't run Landwalker in the main deck because its destruction redirect ability is not as useful as it once was, for me at least, for without a Kozmotown on the field, it really doesn't do much good. Again, Landwalker also is another one of those, I'm very good against certain decks, and I'm basically a dead draw against other decks. For the Psychics, or Pilots, I run 1 copy of Dark Lady. Her monster negation effect is great, but her 2200 attack and level 5 standing hurt the idea of running multiple copies. 2 copies of Wicked Witch for field control and attack power. I'd like to run 3, but deck space issues. 3 copies of Goodwitch for board breaking, for its flip face down effect is rather effective at taking care of spell speed 2 interrupters that your opponent has on the field, like Brident, Three Toads, etc., because it can flip them face down, and if they attempt to counter, Goodwitch can just jump out of the way, replacing herself with the ship. The fact that Link monsters cannot be flipped face down is somewhat irrelevant. 3 copies of Farmgirl to maximize searching and plussing in the deck, also increasing OTK probability, and 2 copies of Strawman, your vanishing combo potential. For the rest of the monsters, I run 2 copies of Honest. Honest is one of the least respected game changers available in the game, in my opinion. especially for this deck. For a farm girl, just sitting on the field can be psychologically taxing for your opponent when you're sitting with 3 or 4 cards in your hand. What does the opponent do? If they try to remove the farm girl with some form of targeting, you might just jump out of the way and they've just wasted a card. If they try to run her over, you might have Honest and they lose the monster and you get a search. Also, I love one copy of Eater of Millions in this deck, and if it were not for deck space issues, it would be a debate between that third copy of Kozmo Wickedwitch and a second copy of Eater of Millions. Eater is great at plowing the road for OTK pushes, especially when you have Farm Girl in hand, and removing those annoying battle immune monsters, along with forcing the opponent to use interruption on it rather than a Kozmo monster, helping you expand your play further. For the spells, I run 3 copies of Kozmotown, but no additional bells or whistles, so to speak, like terraforming or set rotation with some secondary field spell, because those combos produce too much inefficiency for my taste, and perhaps contrary to popular belief, Kozmotown is not necessary to win. It's definitely a high quality card, but Cosmos will win plenty of times without a Kozmotown on the field. I run 1 copy of Raigeki for board clearance and to aid OTK probability, especially useful for opening the way for Farm Girl. To help Raigeki, I run 2 copies of Dark Hole, which works nicely with your shifts. For summoning assistance, 2 copies of Instant Fusion are significantly helpful for the versatility they provide, as well as the free summons that can be used either as tribute fodder or as an XZ piece. 1 copy of Reasoning, which usually provides a free monster, typically at little net cost, lost to the graveyard. The 1 allowable copy of Emergency Teleport, and 1 copy of Monarchs Stormforth. Anyone who thinks Emergency Teleport will ever return to more than 1 allowable copy has probably forgotten how devastating it is in Cosmo. While they are not bad cards, I don't choose to run Allure of Darkness or Gold Sarcophagus. One of the problems with these 2 cards now is that they are almost entirely dependent on having Kozmotown on the field, for Allure is great with Town. Not good at all without it, because of the loss of a commonly useful I can use it right now resource for the acquisition of 2 unknowns that may stall your tempo. Also, with a number of decks now running set rotation, it is quite possible to be locked out of Kozmotown for a good portion of the duel, heavily limiting the value of both Allure and Gold Sarcophagus. For the traps, I run 1 copy of Solemn Warning, 1 copy of Torrential Tribute, and 1 copy of Kozmojo. One may question why I'm only running 1 copy of Kozmojo because it is an excellent card. However, the problem I find with Kozmojo in the main deck is that it typically does not help ward off the worst 1-for-1 threats that hurt this deck, i.e., it doesn't do anything against Kaijus, it does nothing against Ash Blossom. It is great against Banish Eliminators like Imperial Iron Wall or Tycho the Ghost Destroyer, etc., and spot removal for lone slip riders like Castel, and it's great against Ultimate Conductor Tyranno. But there are enough outs to this deck for most of those cards, in my opinion, that Kozmojo can be a little inconsistent. Because without that ship, it's typically a 2-for-1 that doesn't really work out in your favor very well. Multiple copies are in my side deck, though, because after that first duel, once you figure out what you're facing, you have a better idea of, all right, this is definitely a 3 Kozmojo deck versus, okay, it's a 1 Kozmojo deck. Now, obviously, there are 5 deck spaces remaining. These spaces have seen a lot of occupants over the duration of the deck. Valid options are Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit for interruption or some synchro playmaking, in addition to your own Ash Blossoms. Juraghetto's always been a solid card in Cosmos for life gain, tribute fodder, and OTK pushes. Drowning Mirror Force for when your board is broken, you will typically have a clear field and will need that turn to rebuild in a sense. And in my opinion, Drowning does that much better than Quaking for Cosmos. For my taste, I simply like running the generic 2 copies of Mystical Space Typhoon to address opponent floodgates, taking some of the pressure off Sliprider, and removing Diagram from the field to make Masterpiece much more killable, so to speak. I run the Mystical Space Typhoons instead of the Cosmic Cyclones because of the associated life point cost with activating the Cyclones. For, as mentioned, this deck has enough self-inflicted damage cards. Sending Diagram to the graveyard is really not that big of a deal. For the final 3 cards, I run the aforementioned Drowning Mirror Force. While some could argue that Drowning Mirror Force is a little soft against Masterpiece, you could make the argument that 99% of the cards in the game at one point or another are soft against Masterpiece. It is such a blowout card against basically everything else that it works really well in the main deck. And if you find that after you know what your opponent is playing, you don't like it so much, you can just easily side it out for a better option. For the extra deck, I run 1 Sea Monster of Theseus, 1 Panzer Dragon, 1 Darkfire Dragon. Again, this can be just any level 4 that can be brought out by instant fusion. 1,000 Eyes Restrict. Now, that's 4 fusion monsters, but I only run 2 instant fusions. Due to the extra deck space in Cosmos, I like giving instant fusion a little more versatility. 1 Vermillion Dragon, 1 Scrap Dragon, 1 Black Rose Dragon. Ancient Fairy Dragon's one of the kind of almost hidden great cards in the modern meta right now, because if you have Kozmotown on the field, you bring it out with your Strawman and your Sea Monster, pop your Kozmotown, get 1,000 life points, get another Kozmotown, and get a search off the first Kozmotown. And if you don't have a Kozmotown, more than likely your opponent's going to have a field spell, so you get to pop their field spell, get 1,000 life points, and add a Kozmotown. 1 Constellar Pleiades, 1 copy of Artifact Durendal, great card for snuffing out your opponent's critical effects and almost in a sense forcing them to destroy Kozmotown because it's the only spell or trap on your field. 1 number 103 Ragnazero, 1 Castel, the Skyblaster Musketeer, 1 Tornado Dragon, 1 Abyss Dweller, and 1 Gagaga Cowboy. Now, one might notice a glaring omission from my extra deck lineup versus the standard Cosmo extra deck lineup, no Infinity or Nova. Well, this deck is built for Link Summoning, and Link Summoning unfortunately says bye-bye to going into Nova and then Infinity, without at least 2 open Link arrows, to the way Utopia the Lightning has been lost in its Utopia-based summons. However, before Link Summoning arrives, if Nova and Infinity interests you, which it should, replace any 2 monsters you do not favor and add them in. In the end, there is not much to rehash that has not already been said. Pure Cosmo good, hybrid Cosmo bad. Well, it's not that simple, but in my experience, Cosmos should be run as a pure build to maximize its OTK power, control, and synergy, while leaving the other deck spots open to more effective generic techs. In my experience, hybridization is more flash and more memorable, but tends to produce less quality results over the long term because of those consistency problems. Too often you run into a hand where it's just like, well, I've lost and we haven't begun playing yet. Well, that's my Cosmo deck. Thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.